it was really in that moment that it occurred to me that these people didn't understand what it meant for a queer person to say, this was my person. So I think my own insecurities caused me to feel like I was taking up space in a place that wasn't meant for me.
Hello, and welcome to our third installment of Pride and Healing Hearts, a special series of our Mad and Lucy Mind the Gap podcast. I'm Lucy, pronouns she, her, and I'm excited to keep the conversation going around these stories of relationships and healing within the LGBTQIA+ community.
And I'm Mad, pronouns she, her. As you know, this series focuses on individuals from the LGBTQIA+ community who face the challenge of coming out to loved ones, only to see some of those relationships crumble. We're exploring their journeys of healing and moving forward despite these challenges while finding strength in their identities and their communities.
Today, we're honored to have Alex Adams, a queer millennial funeral director whose unique perspective on life and death has shaped her understanding of healing and resilience. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be a part of this important conversation.
Alex, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us about your coming out experience and what that was like for you in terms of your family and friends' reaction?
Absolutely. I think it's impossible to share my coming out story without sharing a little bit about my roots and how I grew up. So I'd love to start there.
Yeah, please.
I grew up in small town, Southern Indiana. The community I grew up in was very conservative and very Christian. There was little to no diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, culture, or even socioeconomic status. And certainly not in religious identity. There were no living examples of queer folks in my world at that time. I grew up in the Church of God, specifically the Church of God movement out of Anderson, Indiana. My mom's side of the family had roots in the Church of God movement, and my dad's dad was a non-denominational preacher. So I would say that the majority of my upbringing, I was heavily churched. And for the most part, as a child and teen, I really enjoyed that. That was, where all of my social outlets were, aside from sports. I attended church every Sunday and went to Sunday school before and went to Bible study on Sunday nights if I could convince my great grandma to take me back to church with her. I'd spend summers at church camp, both as a camper and a camp counselor for younger kids. And my dad was on our church camp board and played in the church band. And if you are not aware of the history of the Church of God out of Anderson, it has a longstanding history of not being supportive of same-sex relationships. So that's really just the environment that I was immersed in. So all this to say, and perhaps paint the picture for you that when I came out, it was not well received. My parents really did not accept that part of me, and we had little to no contact for many years. And truthfully, what contact there was very hurtful because it was so limited and so surface level. And so, really filled with their obvious disdain for me and my, quote, lifestyle at that time. So thankfully, my relationship with my parents has now been repaired. But for many years, it really wasn't. My dad's side of the family, though, completely disowned me. So they believe wholeheartedly in the Bible's teachings and really hold on to the 2 John teaching of, not allowing evil into the house. So they took my pictures down in their home and never looked back. And it's been more than 12 years now since I've had a relationship with my dad's side of the family.
Wow. That sounds incredibly challenging.
Yeah, it certainly was, and still is, honestly.
And through this turmoil, you also had one supporter. Was that right? Would you mind sharing a little bit about your grandfather and how he supported you through that?
Yes. So my dad's dad, my pop, through all of this was truly my strongest support and my biggest fan. The day he found out that I had come out, I had actually met him at the golf course for a tea time. That was something that I grew up doing, going golfing with my pop. And I had come out to my mom the day of or the day before, I don't remember which, but I'll never forget. We were on the first tee box, and he looked me in the eyes and he put his hands on my shoulders like he always did when he was going to have some sort of serious conversation with me. And he said, let's just talk about the elephant in the room. Your mom called me and told me, and I love you and I'm proud of you, and nothing will ever change that. Now let's go play some golf. So that really just kind of paints the picture of our relationship from the day he found out that I had come out as a lesbian at that time. And, from that point on, I never once doubted his love for me. My wife and I were married on June 25th, 2014. So that is the day that marriage equality was passed in Indiana.
Wow.
We went to the Justice Building and we were married there on the steps. I think both knowing full well that there would be no family, support, let alone celebration. But I called my pop after we were married just to let him know. And he asked us to come over that night. And so when we got there to his house, he and my aunt were waiting on us with a Kroger cake to celebrate. And so that's really just, another representation of just how he was and his constant presence and love and support in my life.
It's so touching.
Well, I'm so glad, I'm so glad you had at least that.
Yeah, he was an incredible man.
Yeah. But so it sounds like that was an extremely special and important, right, supportive bond, and that helped you through at least that initial, turmoil. But then you lost your grandfather, right?
Yes.
So what happened then, and what impact did that have?
Yeah. My pop died in October of 2022. He had battled 7-year fight with cancer. Truly, he had many stem cell transplants and CAR T cell transplants and many different variations of chemo. But it was a long battle for him. I had been there with him through a lot of that, but really more so he had continued to be there for me through all of that. And so, at the time that he passed, my relationship with my parents had since been repaired. But even though things were better with them, it was like his death, really my entire world just came crashing down. It stirred up so many things in me that I had long been grieving and really didn't even realize that I had been grieving. I was almost 30 years old with a wife and 3 small children and, this whole beautiful family of my own. And somehow when he died, I still felt like a small child with no parents and nobody in the world, left to care about me, even though that wasn't entirely true. That's just kind of what came over me. So, I'd say, something about losing the person who I'd never once doubted that he loved me or that his presence was going to be constant in my life. It was really just completely shattering. It brought up a lot of really old wounds from coming out and reminded me that even when my parents weren't there, he was. It brought up, it brought on this new grief for my grandparents who are still living, yet aren't speaking to me. It brought on this deeply painful awareness that, my siblings and my cousins still have grandparents, yet I don't.
And so in that, you're not only facing this challenge of like finding a supportive community or just a supporter in general that both understood your grief just for your grandfather, but also just for pieces of your identity and how that relationship that shaped it so deeply. How did you navigate that part?
Yeah. So, I did spend some time going to grief support groups right after his death. And it was an incredible group that I was a part of. It's put on by an amazing organization full of lots of caring people. But each week, I just felt like I had to justify my presence. It wasn't necessarily the group that made me feel that way, so much as it was their lack of understanding for my circumstances. This group was filled with so many folks who'd lost their spouse, parents, or even children. And I was the only person there that was seeking support for a grandparent. Mm. So I think my own insecurities caused me to feel like I was taking up space in a place that wasn't meant for me. Mm. But as a funeral director, I also had this really deep belief in the importance of grief support spaces. So my best friend is actually also a funeral director, and we had gone out to dinner one night, and I was kind of telling her, I don't think I'm going to go back. And she said, Alex, why is it that you think everyone else is deserving of this space, but you're not? He was your person, just as those people are grieving their person too. It was really in that moment that it occurred to me that these people didn't understand what it meant for a queer person to say, this was my person. For queer people, often your person really carries so much weight that non-queer folks tend to not realize. Often what that means is that our person is the one person who never turned their back, who never made us second guess our belonging or our worthiness or our humanity. Our person is often the one person who loved us and encouraged us to keep going when many others turned their back. So it was kind of through all of this that it occurred to me that if I had been sitting in a room full of queer people and I'd said he was my person, everyone there would have understood what that meant. So it kind of all just took off from there.
I love this idea of, your person. And obviously it's even more important when you've lost all the people who are supposed to be your people. So yeah. I think that's beautiful. And also the realization that being queer really made you feel like having that one person was even more important. And I'm sure that's, fairly universal experience. So it's clear how this all shaped you. And it led you to take on a new role, right? So tell us about that decision to become a grief support group facilitator and kind of more about what inspired you to create the Indianapolis Queer Grief Community.
Yeah. So after having this sort of revelation of, wow, if I was just sitting with a bunch of queer people, they would understand what I'm talking about, what I'm saying here, without having to re-explain it every week. I started looking for queer specific grief support spaces. And I had found a couple across the country that were, literally a couple. There's one in Portland, maybe a couple other online specific spaces, but I realized that there was no queer specific grief support group in Indiana. And so I started kind of throwing around this idea to my therapist each week, actually. And I'd be like, someone really needs to start this. This doesn't exist. I think part of me was hoping maybe she'd pick it up and run with it. But yeah. So, but I'll never forget the moment she looked at me and she said, Alex, who else would do this than you? You're a funeral director. You've been trained as a grief support group facilitator, which I had, coming right out of mortuary school. You work with grieving people for a living. You are grieving. And last time I checked, you're also queer. So, I sat with that for a little while, and like I always do when I get some sort of new big idea, I just obsessively started researching anything I could get my hands on, or anyone that would talk to me in regards to starting and facilitating a peer-to-peer grief support group. So just a year and 10 days after my pop's death, I launched the Instagram page for Indianapolis Queer Grief Community, and it really just took off like wildfire. Within hours of the page being, public, I was getting messages messages from people just saying like, I've been looking for this space and it hasn't existed until now. So it was really incredible to see that I wasn't the only one that had been looking for this space.
Wow, that's so powerful. I'm curious, in the time since it's taken off, what impact have you seen this group having on the members, and what do you hope to kind of achieve going forward with it?
Indianapolis Queer Grief Community really has had such a profound impact in less than a year. We launched on November 1st, 2023. That was just the launching of the Instagram page. We didn't hold our first support group until the beginning of this year. So, this summer we had tabled at several Pride events, and it was just incredible to see the ways that people were coming up. And, it kind of, grabs your attention when you're at a Pride event and it's like all happy and full of joy and loud music and glitter. And you see this big sign that says, queer support for your queer grief journey. So it grabs everyone's attention, but really just the impact, I think, has been people realizing like this space that I needed at some point, or maybe didn't know I needed, is here, and they're ready whenever I am ready to come to them. So many participants have shared that they really just feel like they've finally found a space where they can feel seen and understood, where they don't need to explain or justify, their grief as a queer person. And honestly, a lot of the feedback has been, hey, here's a space where I don't have to worry whether or not my pronouns will be respected, or whether or not if I have to worry about my emotional or physical safety. So we've witnessed a lot of people building connections and supporting each other outside of our support groups, which has been so cool. People meeting up to play basketball and just have coffee and lunch. And, they're finding ways to support each other. People that didn't know each other before now know each other in this capacity and are kind of able to share their grief journeys together. So it's been really neat to witness. Going forward, I would say, my biggest hope for Indianapolis Queer Grief Community is truly just to expand our reach and deepen our impact. My main focus is continuing to spread the word that there is, in fact, a queer-specific grief support group in Indiana, and, that we're ready with open arms whenever that time comes. Because the reality is that death and grief are so universal, and we want to make sure that grief support is too.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm curious if these spaces where people come together to grieve, do you have any kind of like digital outlets for that? Like, I know that sometimes people have created like Facebook groups to kind of bridge that location gap. Like, is that something that you've done, or is it more like local in person? I imagine it's probably more impactful when you're able to see another person face to face, but I was just curious.
Yeah, our main focus from the beginning was to kind of put people in the same room together. I think that there is so much power in sitting in a room full of people where you can feel their emotions, and you can literally feel that I am not the only one feeling this. Yes. So our big focus has been to get people to meet each other in person. However, we are looking actually into ways to continue like support group spaces virtually after folks have already met in person. So it is important to us that we kind of get folks to meet in person where they can sense a certain level of safety. We know, who each other is, but then can kind of continue on after the 6 weeks of support group with like a larger group of folks who have already met in person.
I love that. That makes so much sense.
I'm just curious to know, how did you become a funeral director? It is very outside my personal frame of reference, which is based on 6 Feet Under. Okay.
Yes. I had never watched 6 Feet Under until after I'd already made it all the way through mortuary school. And I was in my internship, which is required by the state of Indiana to serve a 1-year internship under a licensed funeral director. And the funeral home I was working at the time, they were all making fun of me. They're like, how did you go to mortuary school and you've never seen 6 Feet Under? But I'll give you that. It is a really good one. How did I become a funeral director? Gosh, I actually started out, I had gone to school for psychology and criminal justice. I graduated high school a semester early with academic honors and was dead set that I was going to be the next Spencer Reed from Criminal Minds.
Oh my God.
So I jumped right into school full force. I was trying to learn every, world language I could. And at some point, I just realized that it was probably not going to be like it was on Criminal Minds. So I had started taking some other classes, really, really started to enjoy studying religious studies. Honestly, I think that was in part because of the environment that I grew up in. I had no exposure to anything other than, the Church of God teachings. And I was starting to learn more about world religions and rituals and just became so fascinated and kind of took some time off school and was like, how can I make a career out of this? And I, at some point, came across the idea of being a funeral director and the way that, end of life rituals are so important, with funerals and ceremonies and whatnot. So I signed up to take the introductory class at the local mortuary program at the community college. I job shadowed one day for a funeral director or with a funeral director and immediately just fell in love. It was like something clicked and I was like, this is what I was meant to do. So after that, I just never looked back.
Wow. I mean, just the term mortuary school.
Yeah, that was one thing I was honestly afraid of because as far as I think the mortuary aspect, we think of the back of house work. And I knew that I was so driven by, this interest in helping people with what they need to do to feel closure at end of life. But I wasn't thinking about somebody has to actually take care of the bodies. And so I was really worried about my first day in the prep room. And my first day I helped with, and, I watched an embalming, and to watch someone have this talent and ability to take someone who has maybe died in a situation, in a nursing home where they've lost lots of weight and they don't look like the person that their family once knew, to be able to kind of take someone and help them look more the way that the family remembers them and give that family that last final moment of peace. Something about that was just if I could do this for people, that would be, I could make a living doing that.
That's amazing.
Thank goodness.
Yeah. that's the response I normally get is thank goodness, because we need someone who can do it.
It needs doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, there aren't many things more certain.
Yeah.
Our last question for you, Alex, is, we always try to leave our listeners with sort of what can they do? What can we learn from your experience and the things that you've accomplished? So I'm curious, what advice would you give them? What are some practical steps that they can take to start healing those strained relationships or to even heal themselves if reconciliation isn't possible?
Well, first, I just want to acknowledge that, for anyone who's working through strained relationships or dealing with, a lack of reconciliation, that's an incredibly painful and isolating journey to be on. And I think it's important to recognize that, for anyone in that situation, your feelings are valid. And any sort of healing journey, whether it's alone or with someone else, takes time. And I also think that it's important to realize that, especially in a situation that can feel so isolating, it is often hard to remember that while your situation is unique to you, it is also likely that it's very similar to a situation that other folks have experienced, specifically within the queer community. And so my biggest piece of advice would be to find a space and connect with other people who understand the kind of pain that you're feeling. And, of course, we'd love for that to be Indianapolis Queer Grief Community. If you're in this area, I cannot stress enough the positive impact that we've seen from folks finding space amongst other people who just get it. Over the summer, we had someone leave us a note as we were tabling an event at Pride, and it was a little Post-it note. And on that note, they had written a quote that said, "Pain shared is pain lessened, and joy shared is joy multiplied." And I think that truly would be my biggest piece of advice.
I love that. Pain shared is pain lessened, and joy shared is joy multiplied. Thank you for sharing it.
Alex, your story is a powerful testament to resilience and the importance of finding or creating supportive communities. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
So to our listeners, if Alex's stories resonates with you, or if you find yourself in need of support, remember that communities like Alex's are out there, and reaching out can be a profound step to healing.
For anyone interested in connecting with the Indianapolis Queer Grief Community, we'll provide contact info in our show notes. Please don't hesitate to seek out spaces that affirm and support your journey.
And thanks again, Alex, for joining us today and for everything that you do. And to our listeners, keep minding the gap and supporting each other. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.